I bought a teleporter sold for scraps. It took me to the alien queen's room. The heavy industrial hum of the Scrap Hawk's engine was the only company Oliver had kept for 6 months, a vibration that settled into his bones like a second gravity. He wiped a smear of grease from his forehead, leaving a dark streak across his skin that matched the unruly, dark hair falling into his eyes. In front of him sat the unit, a geometric nightmare of alien alloys and pulsing conduits that the Grolak merchant had sworn was a high-yield plasma cutter. Oliver knew better. He knew the resonance of a spatial displacement drive when he felt it, even one this damaged, this old. It was junk to the galaxy, but to a human engineer with a penchant for breaking rules, it was a challenge. He adjusted the final caliper on the jury-rigged power supply, his lean, muscular frame tense with anticipation. He didn't want to cut metal. He wanted to see if he could make the universe blink. "All right, you beautiful, broken thing," Oliver whispered, his voice rough from disuse. "Show me where you've been." He slammed the activation stud. There was no whine of powering up, no gradual build. There was simply a feeling of being turned inside out, a violent, silent lurch that tasted like ozone and copper. The grime of his ship vanished. The air changed instantly, from the stale, recycled tang of a hauler to a sterile, chilling purity that stung his lungs. Oliver stumbled, his boots skidding not on metal grating, but on a floor of seamless, polished obsidian that seemed to drink the light. He blinked, his intense brown eyes adjusting to the sudden, ethereal glow of the chamber. This was not a random coordinate. This was a sanctuary. In the center of the vast, circular room stood a monolith of transparent plasteel and silver machinery, a regeneration pod of a design so advanced it looked more like art than medical technology. And inside, floating in a suspension of shimmering, viscous fluid, was the most breathtaking creature Oliver had ever seen. She was humanoid, but possessing an elegance that made his own human frame feel clumsy and dense. Her skin was a pale, luminous white that seemed to hold its own light, flawless and ethereal. But it was her hair that caught him, a floating halo of stark, brilliant white drifting in the suspension fluid like liquid silk, framing a face of sharp, aristocratic angles and high cheekbones. She was naked, her body long and sculpted, a vision of alien perfection that stirred a heavy, immediate heat in his gut that had nothing to do with the teleportation sickness. But she was dying. The pod was screaming silently, the readouts on the obsidian surface flashing a frantic, complex pattern of violet light. Oliver moved before he thought, his instincts shifting from scavenger to mechanic. He didn't need to read the alien script to understand the vibration of a failing turbine or a sickly whine of a power coupling losing coherence. He placed his hands on the cold surface of the pod. The vibration was all wrong, stuttering, terrified. The monolithic perfection of the alien tech was its downfall. It couldn't adapt to a cascade failure. It was trying to be perfect while it bled out energy. "You're drowning in protocol," Oliver muttered, his jaw setting. He ripped the panel off the base of the pod, ignoring the warning shock that numbed his fingertips. The wiring inside was light-based, fragile, and beautiful. He reached into his belt, pulling out a clunky, scarred multi-tool and a coil of heavy-gauge copper wire he'd scavenged from an Earth-era derelict. It was ugly, primitive, and exactly what this delicate system needed. He bypassed the delicate flow regulators, jamming the copper leads into the primary energy ports, forcing the system to accept raw, unmodulated power. It was a brute force solution, a human solution. The pod shuddered violently. Inside, the woman's eyes snapped open. They were wide, a startling liquid silver that seemed to pierce right through the plasteel and into Oliver's mind. For a second, the readout spiked red, then settled into a steady, rhythmic thrum. He had hot-wired the queen of the stars. He looked up, breathless, meeting her gaze. She was staring at him not with gratitude, but with a mix of shock and imperious confusion, her silver eyes tracking the sweat dripping down his face, the grease on his hands, the sheer, messy vitality of him. Firaela could not breathe, but she could feel. The suspension gel, usually a numb void, was vibrating with a new, aggressive frequency, the raw electrical current the human had forced into her sanctuary. She looked at him, this creature of dirt and heat, who had violated the sanctity of her regeneration chamber. He was studying the diagnostics with a ferocious intensity, his dark eyes darting, his hands moving with a speed and confidence that terrified her. He was crude, he was dirty, and he was the only reason her heart was still beating. Stable. Oliver exhaled, the word heavy in the silence. He leaned his forehead against the cool glass, his adrenaline crashing into a sudden, acute awareness of her nakedness, her proximity. She drifted closer to the glass, her movement sluggish but deliberate. She placed her palm against the inside of the pod, directly opposite his forehead. The heat of him radiated through the barrier, a searing point of contact in her cold world. She had been taught that humans were chaotic, primitive, a species of mud and iron. Yet this machine, her machine, the pinnacle of Kryll engineering, had failed her. He had not. The realization sparked a strange, unfamiliar heat in her chest, a curiosity that felt dangerously like desire. She was a queen, the pinnacle of evolution, and she was currently being kept alive by copper wire and human stubbornness. The silence was broken by a soft rhythmic pinging from the device Oliver had dropped on the floor. The teleportation core. It wasn't dead. It was broadcasting. Oliver froze, his mechanic's ear tuning in instantly. Distress beacon, he cursed softly, straightening up. I didn't just jump here. I answered a call. He looked at Firaela, his expression hardening from relief to protection. He began to pace the room, his eyes scanning the walls not for art, but for weakness. He needed to fortify. He needed to turn this tomb into a fortress. Firaela watched him, her silver eyes following the roll of his shoulders, the flex of his back muscles under his worn shirt. He was moving furniture, ripping decorative panels from the walls to create barricades, treating priceless Kryll heirlooms like scrap metal. It was sacrilege. It was magnificent. Oliver found the door mechanism and jammed it with a piece of high tensile piping. He turned back to the pod, his gaze locking with hers. Listen to me, he said, his voice deep and vibrating through the glass. I don't know who you are, but that signal is going to bring trouble. Your tech is too polite to stop a breaching charge. I'm going to make this room dangerous. Firaela pressed her hand against the glass again, watching him. She felt a shift in the room's atmosphere, a thickening of the air. It wasn't just the threat of arrival, it was him. His presence filled the sterile chamber with a scent of ozone, sweat, and something musky and uniquely male. It invaded the scrubbed air filters, tantalizing her senses which were heightened by the regeneration cycle. She should be repulsed. Instead, she felt a tightening low in her belly, a biological response to his overt display of dominance over her environment. He was taking control because she couldn't. Do what you must, she projected, her thoughts interfacing with the pod's external speakers. Her voice was melodic, harmonic, but laced with a weakness that shamed her. They are the Obsidian Guard. They do not stop. Good, Oliver grinned, a flash of white teeth in his grime-streaked face. It was a predatory, confident look that made Firaela's breath hitch. I hate boring guests. He went to work on the room's environmental controls. The Kryll preferred stasis, balance. Oliver introduced volatility. He rigged the atmospheric recyclers to overpressurize the entry corridor, turning the air itself into a concussive weapon. He stripped the coolant lines from the secondary stasis units and rigged them to spray super-cooled liquid at the doorway. He was turning her sanctuary into a death trap, and he was doing it with a hummed tune under his breath and a terrifying competence. A heavy thud reverberated through the obsidian floor, then another, the rhythmic pounding of magnetic boots on the outer hull. The guard had arrived. Oliver moved to the pod, placing himself between Firaela and the door. He held a heavy plasma wrench in one hand, his multi-tool in the other. He looked back at her, and the intensity of his gaze stripped her bare more effectively than her lack of clothing. "Stay with me," he commanded. "Don't fade." "I am awake," Firaela replied, her voice stronger. The threat had sharpened her mind, but it was Oliver's presence that anchored her. She watched the door begin to glow a dull, angry red as a cutting laser bit into the other side. The breach was explosive. The door didn't open, it disintegrated inward. Two figures in sleek black combat armor stepped through the smoke, their weapons raised. They were perfection in motion, efficient, deadly. They stepped right into Oliver's trap. He triggered the coolant line. A blast of sub-zero fog erupted, blinding the lead assassin and freezing the joints of his armor in an instant. The guard stumbled, his perfect efficiency shattered by a simple thermodynamic trick. Oliver didn't hesitate. He lunged, swinging the heavy wrench with a brutal, calculated force that cracked the assassin's helmet visor. It was a brawl, messy and violent, a stark contrast to the elegant energy weapons the guard carried. Firaela watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had seen war, orchestrated from a distance, calculated in probabilities. She had never seen a man fight for her with his bare hands. Oliver was a blur of motion, using the environment, dodging plasma bolts that scorched the obsidian walls, turning the debris of the room into weapons. He was chaos incarnate, dismantling their order. He took down the second guard with an improvised taser spike driven into the suit's neck seal. The room fell silent, save for Oliver's heavy breathing. He stood amidst the wreckage of her perfect room, bleeding from a cut on his cheek, looking like a god of war carved from rough stone. He turned to her, his eyes wild, the adrenaline flooding his system seeking an outlet. He strode to the pod. The power surge from the fight. "The pod is destabilizing again," he panted, having his hands against the console. "The bile filter is clogged. I can't clear it from here." "The internal access," Firaela gasped, the fluid around her beginning to cloud. "It is the only way, but it is forbidden." "Forbidden doesn't keep you alive," Oliver growled. He keyed the emergency release for the maintenance port, a small iris-like opening that led directly into the fluid, right beside her hip. He didn't hesitate. He shoved his arm into the aperture, the seal closing tight around his bicep. The sensation was electric. For Firaela, it was a shock of absolute violation and absolute intimacy. His hand was inside her sanctuary, warm and calloused, moving through the viscous gel. He was blindly feeling for the filter intake, his knuckles brushing against the curb of her hip, the smooth line of her thigh. She arched her back, a silent cry escaping her lips, bubbles of air escaping into the fluid. The contact was searing. "I can feel it," he grunted, his face pressed against the glass, inches from hers. He wasn't looking at the machinery, he was looking at her. He could feel the heat of her skin through the fluid, the tremors running through her muscles. "Hold on." He found the intake and wrenched it clear, his muscles bunching. The fluid cycled, clearing instantly. But he didn't withdraw his hand. The adrenaline, the violence, the sheer overwhelming proximity held him there. He was touching the queen of the Kryll, his hand deep in the lifeblood of her pod. "Why?" she whispered, her silver eyes locking with his, her pupils blown wide. "Why do you fight for me? You are nothing." "I'm the guy holding your life support together, and right now, I'm the only thing standing between you and the void." "You are," she struggled, her alien mind failing to categorize him. "You are chaotic." "I'm human," he corrected, his voice dropping an octave, "and we don't let beautiful things die." The compliment was rough, unpolished, and it shattered her last defense. The realization hit her then that this wasn't just a rescue, this was a claim. "Oliver," she said, testing the name, the sound of it foreign and heavy on her tongue. "The pod, it is not just for me." He paused, his hand still resting intimately on her, sensing the shift in her tone. "What do you mean?" "It is the Source Matrix," she confessed, the secret spilling out under the pressure of his gaze. "My genetic code, it is the template for the next generation. If I die, my race ends. The guard, They do not want to kill me, they want to take the Matrix. They want to harvest me. The twist hung in the air between them. Oliver's eyes widened, the stakes ratcheting up from survival to extinction-level event. He wasn't just saving a woman, he was saving a future. The weight of it settled on him, not as a burden, but as a purpose. Then they'll have to go through me, he said, and the conviction in his voice was absolute. He withdrew his hand slowly, the loss of contact leaving a cold ache in Firaela's side. He hit the release for the main seal. I can't protect you in a glass box. We need to move, and I need you fighting, not floating. The pod hissed open. The gel drained away in a rush, leaving Firaela gasping on the floor of the pod, wet, shivering, and magnificent. Oliver reached in, grabbing her arms, pulling her out of the slick interior and against his chest. The contact was wet, messy, and fiercely hot. Her pale, luminous skin against his dark, grease-stained coveralls. Her height matched his, her silver eyes level with his brown ones. The air in the room was freezing from the coolant blast, but the heat between them was suffocating. Firaela trembled, not from cold, but from the overwhelming sensory input of his body against hers. Hard muscle, rapid heartbeat, the smell of violence and care. "You are warm," she whispered, her hands instinctively clutching his shoulders, her fingers digging into the fabric. "Adrenaline," Oliver murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. The intellectual brain was shutting down. The primal brain was taking over. They had survived death. They were alive, and the need to affirm that life was a roaring fire in his blood. Firaela felt her own control snap. She was a queen, but right now, she was just a woman in the arms of the only being strong enough to hold her. She leaned in, closing the distance, her lips brushing his. It was a question. Oliver answered with a growl, his hand sliding down her back, pulling her hips flush against his. He kissed her, not with reverence, but with a starving intensity. He tasted of salt and iron. Firaela responded with a ferocity that surprised them both, her alien physiology shifting, adapting to match his heat. Her silver eyes glowed, the violet of her skin deepening to a rich indigo as her blood rushed to the surface. He swept her up, carrying her away from the open, vulnerable pod to the shadowed alcove behind the control banks. He pressed her against the wall, his body a shield and a weight. There was no time for gentleness. The enemy was at the door, and this moment, this collision of two species was a stolen breath before the plunge. Her hands tangled in his dark, shaggy hair, pulling him closer, her body arching into his touch. She needed his chaos. She needed his strength to fill the voids in her perfection. The encounter was frantic, a tangle of limbs and wet skin, a desperate affirmation of existence. Oliver worshipped her with his hands in his mouth, mapping the alien curves of her body, finding the universal language of pleasure that transcended species. Firaela, for the first time in her life, let go. She let him drive, let him dominate the moment, finding a transcendent freedom in his human insistence. As they lay together in the aftermath, the silence of the room returning, the bond between them had shifted from protector and protectee to something far deeper. They were partners. They were a single unit. "We have to go," Oliver whispered, pressing a kiss to her temple, his hand smoothing back her wet, silvery white hair. "Yes," Firaela agreed, her voice steady, stronger than it had ever been. She looked at him, and her silver eyes were clear, fierce. "I know a way, but it requires madness." Oliver grinned, pulling her up. "Madness is my specialty." He moved back to the destroyed teleporter unit. "The core is fried, but the capacitors are holding a charge. If I bypass the safety protocols, we can do short-range jumps. Line of sight. It'll tear the room apart, but it'll get us out." "Blink jumps." Firaela nodded, understanding the physics instantly, though her people would never dare attempt it. "It will be painful." "Better than being harvested," Oliver said, strapping the remnants of the device to his chest with duct tape. He grabbed Firaela's hand, lacing his fingers through his. "Hold on tight. I'm going to aim for the ventilation shafts." He hit the switch. The world shattered. They didn't walk through a door. They were ripped through space. 1 second, they were in the room. The next, they were tumbling through the air of a massive vertical shaft, the wind screaming in their ears. They slammed onto a maintenance grating 3 levels down, the metal groaning under the impact. Oliver groaned, checking his ribs. 1 down. Firaela was already up, her movements fluid despite the bruising impact. She pointed upward. They are tracking the energy signature. We must keep moving. Down. They began a descent through the bowels of the moon base, a nightmare of jumping through walls and floors. Each jump was a concussion, a moment of disorientation that left them gasping, but Oliver held the device together, tuning the frequency by ear, by touch, his human intuition guiding them through the mathematical impossibility of the jumps. Firaela guided him, her knowledge of the base's layout absolute. Maintenance Tunnel 4 Alpha. It leads to the hangar. They jumped again, materializing inside a narrow pipe filled with steam. Oliver shielded her, taking the brunt of the heat, pushing them forward. They burst out into a wide corridor, only to find it blocked. Varek stood there, the commander of the Obsidian Guard. He was massive, encased in armor that looked like it was carved from the void itself. He held a heavy energy pike, and behind him stood a squad of soldiers. Queen Firaela, Varek boomed, his voice amplified. Step away from the vermin. The Matrix must be preserved. The Matrix is not a thing to be harvested, Varek. It is life, and you have forfeited yours. She didn't look at Oliver, but she squeezed his hand. It was the signal. Now, she screamed. Oliver didn't trigger a jump. He triggered the overload. He ripped the capacitor off his chest and hurled it at Varek. The device, unstable and charged with the energy of a dozen jumps, was a grenade of pure spatial distortion. Varek laughed, raising his shield, but you couldn't shield against a tear in reality. The device detonated not with fire, but with a black hole of silence. It crumpled the corridor, twisting the plastid steel walls like paper, sucking Varek and his squad into a singularity that existed for a fraction of a second, before collapsing with a thunderclap that knocked Oliver and Firaela off their feet. Silence returned to the corridor. Varek was gone. The path to the hangar was a twisted wreck of metal, but it was open. Oliver stood up, swaying. He offered a hand to Firaela. She took it, pulling herself up, her silver eyes glowing with a fierce pride. That was entirely lacking in elegance, she said, looking at the destruction. Effective, though, Oliver shrugged, wiping blood from his lip. Yes, she said, stepping close to him, her hand resting on his chest, over his beating heart. Very effective. They reached the hangar. The junkyard was gone, impounded or destroyed, but there was a Kryll royal yacht, sleek and silver. She placed her hand on the lock, and it opened instantly. Inside, the cockpit was a symphony of light and holographic displays. Firaela sat in the pilot's chair, her hands flying over the controls. Oliver sat beside her, watching her. "Where do we go?" he asked. "To the capital," Firaela said. "To the throne. I have a dominion to reclaim and a council to execute. And I will need a royal consort, one who knows how to break things." Oliver smiled, leaning back in the chair. "I'm expensive. I have a galaxy. I think I can afford you." As the ship blasted out of the hangar and into the star-strewn void, Oliver watched the white-haired queen of the stars. He had bought a teleporter for scraps, and it had given him the universe.